Minister is so desperate now, he's so on the run, that he resorted just to outright lies. Outright lies. The idea that I've suggested we should be punished with tariffs, I've never said anything of that kind whatsoever. What I'm saying is the opposite.
Farage Congressional Showdown, a political masterclass. Welcome back to UK Connors, where we dissect British politics with the precision of a Savile Row tailor and the bite of a Fleet Street headline. Before we dive into today's extraordinary tale of political theatre, make sure you're subscribed and that notification bell is ringing, because what happened in Washington this week will fundamentally reshape how you view the current state of British democracy. Picture this: the hallowed halls of the United States Congress, where the most powerful democracy on earth conducts its business, and there, seated before the House Judiciary Committee, is Nigel Farage, not as some backbench curiosity, but as a witness to what he describes as Britain's descent into authoritarian madness. While Keir Starmer was fielding softball questions at Prime Minister's questions, Farage was on the international stage, systematically dismantling the very foundations of Labour's approach to free speech, and doing it with a kind of theatrical flair that would make Shakespeare weep with envy. The irony here is so thick you could cut it with a ceremonial sword from the Tower of London. Here's Starmer, supposedly the guardian of British democracy, reduced to sniping about Farage's absence from Westminster while the Reform UK leader was busy explaining to American lawmakers why their closest ally has apparently lost his collective mind when it comes to fundamental freedoms. It's rather like criticizing someone for missing a village fete while they're addressing the United Nations, technically absent, but rather missing the point, wouldn't you say? Farage's testimony wasn't merely a political speech. It was a masterclass in international diplomacy wrapped in a damning indictment of contemporary Britain. When he rose to take his oath before Congress, extending his right arm in that solemn ritual of democratic accountability, he wasn't just another foreign politician seeking attention. He was a British citizen so concerned about the trajectory of his homeland that he felt compelled to warn America's legislators about the authoritarian drift happening right across the Atlantic. The cases he presented were nothing short of chilling for anyone who believes in the principle that free speech means protecting even the speech we find distasteful. Take Graham Linehan, the comedy writer behind Father Ted, arrested by 5 armed police officers at Heathrow Airport for tweets he'd posted months earlier while in Arizona. 5 armed officers, mind you, in a country where the sight of armed police still sends shivers down the spine of ordinary citizens. Farage painted this scene with devastating clarity: an Irish citizen, not even British, detained for expressing views that someone, somewhere in the labyrinthine corridors of British bureaucracy, deemed problematic. But here's where it gets truly Orwellian. And if you're not subscribed yet, you absolutely should be, because this analysis goes deeper than anything you'll find in the mainstream press. Farage wanted to bring Lucy Connolly to Washington as living proof of Britain's authoritarian overreach. Connolly, remember, posted something offensive on social media during the heightened tensions following the Southport tragedy, deleted it 3.5 hours later, and still received a 31-month prison sentence. 31 months for a social media post that was removed almost immediately. Even more tellingly, she couldn't travel to America to testify about her experience because of the restrictions placed on her movement. If that doesn't send a chill down your spine about the direction we're heading, you might want to check if you still have one. The Democrat Jamie Raskin's response was predictably theatrical, branding Farage a Putin-loving free speech faker and Trump sycophant. But here's a delicious irony that seems to have escaped the good congressman from Maryland. While hurling these accusations, he was simultaneously proving Farage's point about the deteriorating quality of political discourse. Rather than engaging with the substantive concerns about British authoritarianism, Raskin resorted to name-calling and guilt by association. It's the political equivalent of shouting racist when you can't win an argument, intellectually bankrupt, and precisely the kind of behavior that's poisoned democratic debate on both sides of the Atlantic. When Raskin challenged Farage about opposing pro-Gaza demonstrations on Remembrance Sunday, he revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of both British culture and the principle of free speech itself. Farage's response was measured and culturally literate, explaining that Remembrance Sunday holds a particular sanctity in British society, a day when we honor those who died for the very freedoms these protesters claimed to exercise. It's not about suppressing speech. It's about recognizing that rights come with responsibilities, and that context matters in a mature democracy. The Republican praise for Farage as a future prime minister wasn't mere diplomatic courtesy. It reflected a growing recognition among serious political observers that Britain's political establishment has become dangerously detached from both democratic norms and public sentiment. When Darrell Issa referred to him as moving from fringe parliamentarian to probably the future prime minister, he was acknowledging what many in Westminster refused to admit: that Farage's concerns about free speech restrictions aren't fringe positions, but mainstream anxieties that the political class has systematically ignored. Farage's comparison of contemporary Britain to North Korea might sound hyperbolic until you consider the implications of what he was describing. A country where citizens can be arrested for social media posts, where comedy writers face armed police raids for expressing unpopular opinions, where the definition of hate speech expands daily to encompass virtually any criticism of protected ideologies. This isn't a Britain that stood alone against fascism in 1940, and it certainly isn't a Britain that exported democratic values across the globe for centuries. The proposed new definition of Islamophobia that Farage highlighted represents perhaps the most dangerous development in this authoritarian drift. As he pointed out, British public discourse has traditionally included robust criticism of all religions. The Pope, the Archbishop of Canterbury, religious institutions of every stripe have been fair game for satire and critique. But now we're moving toward a system where one particular religion enjoys special protection from criticism, creating what Farage accurately described as a potential for two-tiered justice. If you can mock Christianity but not Islam, if you can satirize Judaism but not certain interpretations of gender ideology, then you don't have free speech. You have a hierarchy of protected classes that fundamentally undermines the principle of equality before the law. The timing of this testimony couldn't have been more politically significant. While Starmer was in full defensive mode, trying to explain away Britain's authoritarian trajectory to a skeptical international audience, Farage was calmly and methodically laying out the case that Britain has lost its way on fundamental democratic principles. The contrast couldn't have been starker. Starmer reactive and defensive, Farage proactive and principled. What made this testimony particularly devastating for the Labour government was Farage's credibility on the international stage. This wasn't some unknown backbencher making wild accusations. This was a politician who had successfully campaigned for Brexit, who had maintained relationships across the Atlantic political spectrum, and who was speaking from a position of genuine concern rather than partisan advantage. When he warned American lawmakers to be vigilant because free speech is being attacked, he wasn't engaging in hyperbole. He was sharing hard-won experience from a country that had already traveled further down the authoritarian path. The response from Starmer's government was predictably petulant rather than substantive. Rather than addressing the concerns Farage raised about British authoritarianism, they focused on his absence from Westminster, as if the parochial concerns of Prime Minister's questions were more important than defending Britain's democratic reputation on the international stage. It revealed a government so consumed with short-term political advantage that it couldn't recognize the long-term reputational damage being done to Britain's standing as a defender of democratic values. And here's something the mainstream media won't tell you. Make sure you're subscribed because we're the only channel brave enough to say it. Farage's willingness to criticize Britain on the international stage actually demonstrates a deeper patriotism than Starmer's defensive crouch. True patriots don't cover up their country's mistakes. They expose them in the hope of correction. Farage wasn't talking down Britain. He was trying to save it from a trajectory that threatens everything that made Britain great in the first place. The questions about his meeting with Donald Trump were handled with typical Farage discretion, neither confirming nor denying while making it clear that such meetings, if they occurred, were entirely appropriate for a senior British politician. The Democrats' obvious frustration at his refusal to be drawn into their partisan games only highlighted their own small-minded approach to serious constitutional questions. When Farage discussed J.K. Rowling's experience with cancel culture, he identified a crucial political realignment that the establishment still refuses to acknowledge. Rowling, coming from the liberal wing of politics as Farage noted, had been subjected to abuse on a huge scale simply for defending the rights of women to have safe spaces. This isn't about left versus right anymore. It's about sanity versus ideological extremism. And the fact that traditional liberals like Rowling find themselves aligned with conservatives like Farage tells you everything you need to know about how far the Overton window has shifted. The broader implications of this congressional testimony extend far beyond the immediate political theater. Farage was essentially arguing that Britain has become a cautionary tale for other democracies, a warning about what happens when governments prioritize ideological conformity over individual freedom. When he suggested that American tech companies and political leaders should consider the trade implications of Britain's authoritarian drift, he wasn't threatening economic warfare. He was pointing out the natural consequences of undermining the liberal democratic values that make international cooperation possible. The fact that Committee Chair Jim Jordan gave Farage such a prominent platform suggests that serious American lawmakers are genuinely concerned about the direction their closest ally is heading. This wasn't mere political theater. It was an intervention, an attempt by Britain's oldest democratic ally to sound the alarm about authoritarian drift in Westminster. What makes this story particularly compelling is how it exposes a fundamental weakness of Starmer's position on civil liberties. While he talks about defending democracy, his government continues to expand the definition of hate speech, continues to prosecute citizens for social media posts, and continues to create an atmosphere where self-censorship becomes a norm rather than the exception. Farage's testimony made it impossible to ignore these contradictions, forcing them onto the international stage where diplomatic niceties couldn't obscure their authoritarian implications. The response from British media was typically revealing, focusing on the drama rather than the substance, treating it as a political soap opera rather than a serious constitutional crisis. But that's precisely why channels like UK Connors exist, to cut through the noise and focus on what actually matters for Britain's democratic future. This congressional appearance represents something of a political masterstroke by Farage. By taking his concerns about British authoritarianism to America's lawmakers, he's internationalized what the British establishment wanted to keep as a domestic issue. He's forced a conversation about free speech that Starmer's government would prefer to avoid, and has done it on a stage where their usual comparison to North Korea might seem overwrought until you consider what Farage was actually describing, a system where citizens modify their behavior based on fear of state punishment for expressing unpopular opinions. That's not democracy. That's soft totalitarianism, and the fact that it's implemented through hate speech laws rather than secret police doesn't make it any less dangerous to human freedom. What this testimony ultimately revealed is a politician who understands that defending free speech isn't about protecting popular opinions, it's about protecting the right to express unpopular ones. When Farage highlighted the cases of Graham Linehan and Lucy Connolly, he wasn't endorsing their views. He was defending their right to hold and express them without facing state persecution. That's a principle that used to be considered fundamental to British democracy, and the fact that it now seems radical tells you everything you need to know about how far we've fallen. The international dimensions of this story can't be overstated. When America's lawmakers start questioning Britain's commitment to free speech, when they begin to see us as a cautionary tale rather than a democratic model, we've crossed a line that will be difficult to uncross. Farage's testimony was an attempt to sound the alarm before that damage becomes irreversible, and history will likely judge him more kindly than his contemporaries for having the courage to speak uncomfortable truths on the international stage. This wasn't just political theater. It was a moment of reckoning for a country that's lost its way on fundamental principles. And while Starmer's government continues to prioritize short-term political advantage over long-term democratic health, politicians like Farage are doing the hard work of defending the values that made Britain worth defending in the first place. Whether you agree with his politics or not, you have to respect his willingness to put country before party, principle before popularity, and truth before political convenience. That's the kind of leadership Britain desperately needs right now, and it's exactly the kind of story we'll continue to cover here at UK Connors. Make sure you're subscribed, hit that notification bell, and prepare for more uncomfortable truths about the state of British democracy. Because if we don't start having these conversations honestly, we might wake up one day to discover that we're no longer the country we thought we were.